Story number 1. Under the Floorboards. The new house smelled. I'm not talking about that usual musty and stiff smell you get when you first move into a new house. This smell was rancid, and it lingered. I first noticed the smell when I was looking at the house. It's not like I had a lot of options. I was fresh out of university and working a part-time job. The house was cheap, and it meant I didn't have to go back to living with my parents. Anyway, by the time I started moving my things into the house, the smell had gotten worse. It was the middle of summer, and the extra heat made the rancid smell stronger. I dealt with it at first by opening up every single window and door in the house. With the fresh, hot air blowing through the house, the smell was just barely tolerable. I tried to busy myself with unpacking all my boxes. I'd like to say that airing out the house helped, that the smell was just due to the house sitting empty for a long time, but it wasn't. There was something else going on. That became obvious as the day went by, and it only got hotter. The heat made the smell grow even stronger. It got to the point where my eyes started watering. I thought that maybe the house was built on top of a sewage pipe that was leaking. I wasn't sure. All I knew was I couldn't spend another second in that house. I left everything open and called my parents. My dad fancies himself a man's man. He likes to fix things himself and does a lot of DIY for his and my mom's house. So he drove over straight away and said he'd look at the problem. The moment he got there, his nose wrinkled up and he started coughing uncontrollably. The smell had gotten even worse since I had called him. He wrapped a scarf around his mouth and went inside the house. After a few minutes, he was convinced that the smell was coming from underneath the floorboards. His theory was that some small animal got under there somehow and died. Honestly, I didn't care what it was. I just wanted the smell gone. My dad got his bag of tools out and I started to feel a little nervous. He said he'd be careful and that I wouldn't even notice if he pulled up one of the floorboards. As nervous as I was, I let him do what he needed to. I stayed outside while he started pulling up my floorboards. A moment or two went by and my dad came rushing out of the house. His face was as white as a sheet, his hands were shaking, and he was on the phone with the police. He wouldn't tell me what was going on. All he did was insist that I stay outside with him, and he wouldn't let me go back inside the house. The police arrived, and before I knew it, my whole house was a crime scene. Now I know why the house was so cheap. It wasn't just the smell that drove people away, it was the house's history. It had belonged to a man who'd been convicted of several crimes, the most serious crime of all being murder. His wife and child went missing and were never found, but there was enough evidence to prosecute, and he was sent to jail for their murder. You might want to know what the smell was coming from. Well, the police finally found the bodies of the man's missing wife and child. He'd chopped them up and hidden them under the floorboards. Story number 2. The previous owner. Around 3 years ago, I moved into a new house in what was supposed to be a quiet and boring neighborhood. My previous apartment was in the middle of downtown New York. The life I lived had been pretty hectic up until that point, so I just wanted to settle down somewhere quiet. My friends helped me with the move. We had some pizza, a few beers, and spent the day unpacking while joking about how boring the town seemed. They left just before it started getting dark, and I was alone in my brand new house. I'd been unpacking all day, so I just felt like chilling for the rest of the night. I opened up another beer and warmed up what was left of the pizza. There wasn't much to do, so I put a movie on my laptop. At some point, I noticed a sound coming from above me. I stopped the movie and listened carefully. It sounded like a soft, banging noise, as if someone was walking around upstairs. The only problem was, there wasn't an upstairs. There wasn't even an attic. I thought that a branch was banging on the roof, even though there was no wind outside. I went outside to have a look. It was really dark, aside from the dim glow from the streetlights. I stepped out into the road and looked up at my house. I scanned the roof, but I couldn't see any branches, and there were no trees anywhere near the house. I was about to give up and go back into the house when I saw it. There were 2 glowing eyes staring directly at me from behind the brick chimney. At first, I thought they belonged to a raccoon or something, but then whoever it was shouted down at me. "This is my house," they screamed in a gruff and demanding voice. I jumped back and the eyes moved forward, followed by a tall, thin silhouette of a man. He moved across the roof on all fours like some kind of animal and made his way towards me. I ran away from him and the house. I made my way across the road and started banging on the door of the closest house. When I looked around, the man who was on my roof was gone. I had left the door to my new house wide open, but now it was closed. The door I was banging on opened eventually, and a very cranky old man screamed at me. I did my best to explain myself, and I convinced him to let me in and use his phone to call the cops. Long story short, the cops got there and found the man inside my house. He was adamant that it was his house and that I'd stolen it from him. Thankfully, I was able to prove to the police that he was lying. No one in the neighborhood had any idea who he was. He wasn't the previous owner of the house, and even the police were baffled. I still live in the same house today, but I haven't had any more crazy men crawling all over my roof. Story number 3, The Friendly Neighbours. This story took place during the early days of my first marriage. I've divorced and remarried since then, and I no longer live in the same house, but this story will stick with me for the rest of my life. Not long after we got married, my husband and I started looking for a new house to move into. It felt like some kind of tradition. We both wanted to have a family one day, so it only seemed right to move into a house where we could start building that family. After a few weeks of searching, we finally found a place. It was perfect, and we moved in as soon as we could. It was big enough for a family of 4. There was a pool in the backyard, and the garden was big enough for our 2 dogs. I loved it at the time. It was long after we moved in that some strange things started happening. First, all of the taps stopped working in the house, and we didn't have any running water for 2 whole days. That's how long it took for the plumbing company to realize that someone had turned the water off to our house. That was just the beginning. I came home so many times to find dead birds by the front door, and there was even a raccoon that drowned in our pool. It was horrible. One night we woke up to both our dogs barking in the backyard. They usually don't bark at all, not even at birds or squirrels, so whenever they do bark, we take it pretty serious. My husband launched out of bed and ran outside wielding his baseball bat and a flashlight. I stayed in bed, phone at the ready, and waited for some sort of sign from him before I called the police. It wasn't long until I heard his voice, shouting at someone to get off our property. I instantly dialed the police and told them what was happening. I had no idea what was going on. I could only hear my husband yelling with someone, and someone else was yelling back. The whole time our dogs continued to bark. It was all so much, but when the police finally arrived, they were able to arrest the intruder, and I felt a little bit of ease. That is, until my husband and I found out the whole story. When he went out into the backyard, he found our neighbor, who'd come over to welcome us to the neighborhood when we first moved in, trying to drown one of our dogs in the pool. I was shocked by the news, but that was all. He was the reason behind all of the strange things that had been happening to us since we moved in. He told the police that his wife and he had been waiting for the house to go on the market so they could buy it. They were annoyed that we had outbid them. They planned on scaring us out of the house with all of their tricks. It's the craziest thing I had ever heard. I don't live in that house anymore, and I have no idea who does. I hope they don't have to deal with the same things that happened to us. Story number 4, The Watcher. I've always had this dream ever since I was a little girl. I would be living in a house in the middle of the woods. I would spend my days surrounded by nature and be completely alone. I'm a little antisocial, so that kind of life is really appealing. Around 4 years ago, I finally made my dream come true. I found this beautifully modern house out in the middle of the woods in Arizona. It was only a few hours' drive away from the nearest town, which means I wouldn't be completely alone, but it was isolated enough for me to jump at the chance. I moved in straight away and started my new life. I'd been living in this new house for over 6 months. I made a few friends in the nearby town, but I managed to maintain the feeling of being completely alone with nature. It was around this time, however, that I started to feel not so alone anymore. I had this feeling that I was being watched all the time. I would hear strange sounds coming from outside the house, like tapping on the windows or scratching at the doors. I thought it was just animals at first, until one day I found some footprints in the mud right outside my bedroom door. I was terrified. I invited some of my friends over to stay the night. I didn't feel like being alone after finding those footprints. The night went by quickly, and it actually ended up being kind of fun. I had never had a girls' night before, so it was a really good night for me. Eventually, we got tired and settled down in our sleeping bags for the night. I took the couch in the lounge so I could be with my friends. I'm not sure what time it was or how long we'd been asleep, but at some point in the night, we all woke up to the sound of screaming. One of my friends had gotten up to get a drink of water. When she started screaming, we all jumped to our feet and ran to her aid. As we got into the kitchen, we all joined her in screaming at the masked man trying to climb through the open window above my kitchen sink. I was frozen in shock. My mouth hung open and a high-pitched scream escaped it, but other than that, I was frozen. Thankfully, one of my friends reacted quickly. She picked up a glass nearby and threw it at the man. It shattered against his head and knocked him to the floor. She rolled the rest of us back into the lounge and locked the kitchen door. We huddled together and waited for the police to get there, which took a while since we were so far away from town. By the time they did get there, the man was gone. I still live in the same house, but I've had some cameras and alarms put in. The man hasn't been back since, but every now and then I get that feeling that I'm being watched again. Story number 5. The New Family Member. I'm the youngest child of 7 kids, and we're always moving from one house to the next. We moved into the house that I live in right now around 2 years ago. My siblings and I were told that we'd each get a room to ourselves. My parents didn't say that one of those rooms was going to be the attic. I was the youngest, so I got my pick of the rooms last. It's no surprise that the only room left was the attic. Honestly, I was okay with it. I'm kind of a loner, and the attic ended up being the largest room in the house. It was more of a loft. All it needed was a bit of cleaning, some decoration, and I knew it'd be a cool room. In the first day of moving there, I already had all my boy band posters hanging on the walls, and my white and pink bed moved in. There was still a lot of unpacking to do, but it was a good start. That night, I left the windows open when I went to bed. It was musty and the air was stiff. I had a small lava lamp that I just couldn't sleep without, so I made sure to set that up as well. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a loud bang. I shot straight up in my bed. It was pitch black and I couldn't see a thing. For some reason, my lava lamp wasn't on anymore. I felt around for the switch and flicked it a couple of times, but it wasn't turning on. I checked the plug by the wall and it was unplugged. I was scared, but I figured one of my brothers snuck in and unplugged it to scare me. I plugged it in and the room lit up instantly. I started searching for whatever it was that made the banging noise. The window I had left open was now closed, and I figured the wind blew it shut. I got up to open it, and that's when I heard it. A deep voice whispered from the dark corner behind me, "Turn the light off." All the blood drained from my face, and my whole body began to shake. That voice didn't belong to any of my brothers. It was far too deep and sounded like an old man. I was frozen in place, but only for a split second. I ran out of that attic as fast as my small legs would carry me, screaming for my mommy and daddy the whole time. I woke up the whole house. Everyone was angry with me, but their anger quickly turned to fear when I told them that there was an old man in the attic. As you probably guessed, we called the police. My mother insisted that my father wait until they got there, so we did. They found the old man asleep in the corner of the attic, behind some of the boxes with my things in them. They also discovered a hole in the way that led to a secret area in the back of the attic. It looked like the man had been living on the other side of that hole for a long time. I still freak out in the middle of the night whenever I hear a sound, but I know that the man isn't there anymore, and my dad has patched up the hole that led to his secret home on the other side of my bedroom wall.